Tonight's talk is an endowed lecture. It is the Adele Zygelbaum Memorial Lecture. And so before I introduce our speaker, I want to introduce Adele Zygelbaum. She was born in Slavkov, a small town near Krakow, Poland in 1924. She was not quite 15 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. In 1941, all the Jews in Slavkov were moved into a ghetto. At 4 a.m. on June 11th, 1942, the Germans forced all the residents from their homes without their belongings. The Germans separated families and committed many murders and other atrocities. Adele never saw her parents, her older brother, or younger sister again, and never found out what their fate was. Adele was transported to a concentration camp in Ottmut, Germany, where she worked in a factory making wooden soles for shoes. In 1943, she was transferred to Ludwigsdorf, where she worked in an ammunitions factory filling shells with gunpowder. From there, she went on to a camp at Gorlitz, where she was liberated by the Red Army. Adele returned to Slavkov soon after the war. She soon reunited with her older sister Esther, who had also survived the camps. In September of 1945, the two of them moved to Wrocław, Poland, in formerly German Silesia. Shortly after arriving, she met Joseph L. Zygelbaum, a well-known hero of the Polish underground, whom she married that December. The newlyweds moved to a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany, from which they emigrated to the United States in late 1946. They lived in New York, where Joseph worked for Forward, the newspaper of the Jewish Socialist Workers Union. Their first son, Arthur, was born early in 1947. Later that year, the family moved to Los Angeles. Their second son, Paul, was born in 1950. Adele and Joseph became American citizens in 1952. Joseph went on to become a well-known technical translator and analyst of Soviet military and space programs. Adele moved to Santa Rosa in 1999 after her husband's death. Adele's advice to young people was, quote, never to forget what happened, to tell the story so it will never happen again, to remember the people that we've lost, to honor those who were not even privileged to have their own graves, and to understand that we are not responsible for our births, but we are responsible for our own conduct. Adele died in 2009. Her sons Arthur and Paul established a memorial endowment in her honor to support the work of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. Okay, now I'm pleased to introduce to you tonight's speaker, James Waller, who is really among the oldest friends now of the lecture series. Jim is, put it simply, one of the world's foremost scholars of genocide. He is the author of many important books, including the landmark Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing, which students have been reading for this week. Jim has also written widely for lay audiences. You might find his work in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. A year and a half ago, I had the honor of introducing Jim at our 40th anniversary celebrations. And I joked then that in the academic world, you can tell how important someone is by the number of titles they have. Jim has a lot of titles. He is the inaugural Christopher J. Dodd Chair in Human Rights and the director of the Dodd Human Rights Impact Programs at the University of Connecticut. Jim is also visiting scholar at the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast, and director of academic programs for the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. This is always one of our most popular talks. I'm thrilled to turn the virtual podium over to Jim now.
Thank you, Stephen, for the kind introduction. Just going to make sure things start here. Does this look the way you want it to on your end? I
That
think
looks
it does.
fine, Jim. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Stephen, for the kind introduction. It's an honor to deliver This particular lecture of such an important figure in the Sonoma State community and the history of this lecture series. It's great, to see so many of you. We've got 74 people checking in here. It's wonderful to have this size of a crowd here for such a incredible program. I always say every time I speak at Sonoma State, you may not realize it, but the opportunity you have in this course and in this program is really unparalleled anywhere else in the country. I don't know of any program that has been as successful and as for as long a time as this program has. I looked quickly at the list of participants and I see many good friends there who I've gotten to know for years over the past 20 years of being able to have this time with you. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person this year. We had a schedule conflict. Tomorrow I start a 3-day atrocity prevention workshop with 12 of the leading scholars in atrocity prevention from around the world. And I'm the host, which means I am working with travel schedules and taxis and everything else, trying to get ready for that workshop that starts tomorrow. But thank you all for being here tonight. We're going to focus our attention on becoming evil, how ordinary people commit genocide and mass atrocity. Let me tell you a bit about the background that I bring to this and the perspective I take to it. I am by training a social psychologist, which means I study how the presence of other people influences how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. In the early 1990s, I offered what I believe was the nation's first course in the psychology of the Holocaust, and I found myself really captured by material in Holocaust and genocide studies as a social psychologist because it gave opportunities to discuss issues of individual agency in situations of extreme behavior. Excuse me. So typically in social psychology, we study individual agency and actions in the context of everyday behavior. But when you can study these things in the extremity of behavior, I think you see with some more clarity the types of behaviors, excuse me, and actions of which we're capable. So obviously, as we think about this range of human behaviors, clearly there are the victims, the people who are victimized by genocide and mass atrocity. I think sometimes those numbers, 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, 800,000 Rwandans, 1.5 million Armenians, the numbers themselves can become a dangerous abstraction. We have to remember that in those numbers, every single one of those is a victim. It's not 6 million victims. If you think of 6,000,001 victims, your attention's drawn to that one. Every individual victim, someone who loved someone, was loved by someone else, who had hopes, dreams, and aspirations that would never be fulfilled, not because of anything they did, but simply because of a group identity they held. In the context of that victimization, we have bystanders that allowed the victimization. We have relatively few resistors and rescuers, but we have plenty of perpetrators, rank and file killers, and that's the point of our discussion tonight. Often what people don't understand, or I think sometimes what people fall into the trap of, is thinking, okay, I know it's 6 million victims, 800,000 victims, 1.5 million victims, but what they forget is for every victim, there is a perpetrator. There's no such thing as a perpetratorless mass atrocity. For every victim, there's someone who pulled a trigger, there's someone who swung a machete, there's someone who clubbed or beat that victim to death. So tonight, our focus is on those people, the people who carried out the hard work of killing. Now, when we talk about perpetrators, one level you can think about perpetrators of the architects, the people who make the policy, develop the policy of mass destruction. You could also think about bureaucrats, people who implement those policies. But my attention over 30 years now has not been at those levels of architects and bureaucrats. They are what philosophers would call necessary, but not sufficient. In other words, if all you have are architects and bureaucrats, there could be some horrible social discourse, some terrible policies being developed, But if you don't have the rank and file, the people who turn policy into practice, mass atrocity is not going to happen. Over the years in Holocaust studies, a large part of the focus was on architects and bureaucrats. You could read a leading textbook in Holocaust studies 20 years ago, close the textbook, and if I asked you, what do you know about the killers? You would talk to me about the architects, Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels. You could talk about the bureaucrats, Eichmann, but you knew next to nothing about the rank and file killers because we knew more about the broad mechanics of mass murder than we did the men and women who carried it out. So for over 30 years now, my focus has been on the rank and file. That started with archival work. When I was teaching in Berlin, Germany, 1989 to 1990, the wall came down. These incredible archives opened in the East. If you could find a good translator, you had access to material that we had never had access to before. And those archives were important sources of information for me as I started this research. But over time, I became frustrated because, as helpful as the archives were, the testimony, the interrogation, the prosecution would go a certain direction, and it was very helpful for me as a psychologist. But at some point, it would turn this direction. As a psychologist, I wanted to go the other direction and ask different questions. Obviously, I couldn't do that with the archival material. So someone had collected it, it'd been done and dusted, nothing I could do with that. So I realized early on that for me to do what I'd like to do with this research, I would have to interview rank and file perpetrators myself. So over the course of the past 20 some years, I've interviewed over 225 alleged or convicted perpetrators of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Two-thirds of those interviews have taken place in prison context where people have been convicted or sentenced. Another third has taken place in communities, in bars, in churches, in parks, where people have either been sentenced and served their time, or in many cases have not been sentenced or convicted and probably never will be. When I do these face-to-face interviews, and we'll talk some in a bit about the results of those type of interviews, when I'm doing this field work, I also take the time to interview survivors and bystanders because they have a strong sense as well, having lived through it, how in the world their neighbors in some cases could turn to these type of atrocities. So I want to start tonight with a story of one of those survivor interviews just to set the context for the central argument I make about perpetrators. This is a woman who survived a massacre in Interahamwe, a Catholic church outside the capital city of Kigali in Rwanda. I was in Rwanda probably, this was 5 years, 4 to 5 years after the genocide, one of my first trips there. My translator said, there's a woman who survived one of these massacres who would like to tell you her story. Um, I was honored to hear her story. When I interview survivors in this way, they tell me what they want to talk about. They talk for however long they want to talk to me, and we do the interview where they want to do it. She wanted to, for the first time, revisit the site of the massacre that she had survived. So we came to this small church in Interahamwe. It is today a memorial. This is a picture of it as we walked up to it. This is my translator to the right. You'll see that it's covered by a metal awning as a place of memory today. You'll see the Rwandan national flag, the purple colors. You see it's a relatively small church and church compound, but within this church compound in April 1994, over 5,000 people were killed by Hutu extremists. So we walked to the front door of this church that you can see here. She couldn't go into the church because the trauma was still too severe for her, but she began to tell me her story. I had actually been to this church before. This would be, I didn't take this picture, but this would have been very similar to what I saw in this church. For several years after the genocide was over, Rwanda's memory practice was to leave the bones where they had fallen. You didn't have, and I've been in several churches like this, you didn't have to look hard to see the defensive wounds on forearms with people trying to protect themselves from machete. You didn't have to look hard to see skulls that have been cleaved in two or skulls with bullet holes. Was Rwanda's practice of memory. Her story was that she was by the window in the top right-hand corner of this church, and the killers came in. They raped some people, some women. They killed everyone they could get their hands on. She was probably sexually assaulted. She didn't share that with me, and I didn't ask. But she did take off her scarf, and she said, "Here by this window, I was cut." And she showed a scar that ran from the front of her neck to the back of her neck, halfway around her neck. She was cut and she was left for dead. As the killers turned their attention elsewhere, she said that she was able to climb on a pile of bodies, 3 to 4 bodies that were by this window, and she was able to regain enough strength to climb out of the window. And then on her hands and knees, she showed me, and we walked together. She walked away from the church to the back of this other building, which is a Sunday school classroom, a classroom for religious education. We walked to the back of this building together, and she said, "Here's where I passed out. Here's where I lost consciousness just simply due to loss of blood." Over the next several hours, she recounted to me that she would occasionally regain consciousness, lose consciousness, regain it, and lose it. But she said every time she was conscious, she would hear this sound from inside this small building, and she described it as just a wet slap. And she said, "I'd hear the slap, a few seconds would go by, I hear it again. I'd lose consciousness. I'd wake up, hear it again." And she said she knew it wasn't machete hitting skin and bone because she had felt that. She knew it wasn't gunfire because she had heard gunfire. She did not know what it was. Eventually, after several hours, a half day of killing, the killers leave the compound. She regains enough strength to crawl around to the front door of this small building, and she looked inside. Again, she did not want to go inside the building with me on this day, but she looked inside, and what she saw, this is the interior of the building, she saw about 125 children who had been killed in this building. And I apologize for the graphic nature of this particular example, and I'm not using it gratuitously. I do think it has an important teaching point for us that we'll see in a moment. She had heard these children being killed, not by machete, not by gunfire, but if you look in the top left-hand corner of this image, you'll see the picture of a blood-stained wall. These children have been swung headfirst against the wall, is how these over 125 children have been killed. For all of its brutality, it's not new, it's not creative. American cavalry troops did this to Native American children in the 1800s, swung them headfirst against the walls of forts to kill them. Jewish children were killed by Ukrainian auxiliary forces in the Holocaust in this way. Armenians killed by Turkish paramilitary forces in this way. Cambodia, if you visit Cambodia and ask to see a site of memory, often you'll be taken to a killing tree where people were swung headfirst against the tree. For the killers, we could go into some deep psychological profundity about this, but I think honestly, it's just efficiency. The killers didn't have to waste ammunition. They didn't have to dull the machete. All they had to do was have the strength to kill children in this way. And again, I start with this example because now I want to turn our attention away from the victims in this case and to the people who did the killing. And if we were together and I asked you, give me some words to describe the people who did this killing, a lot of the words people come up with are psychotic, lunatic, sadistic, crazy, beast, the manifestation of our worst nightmares. But I start with this example because a few years after this, I was back in Rwanda doing research on perpetrators and interviewing some perpetrators in a prison in Kigali. And one of the perpetrators I interviewed, I didn't have his charge sheet when the interview started. So I didn't know what he'd been convicted of, where he did what he did, how many people he killed, and so on. But we started the interview, and at some point, maybe 3 to 4 minutes into it, he said something that kind of, touched a memory for me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And then about 5 minutes later, he said something else, and I realized exactly what the memory was, that just by coincidence, I happened to be interviewing a perpetrator who had been in this room in Interama and had not only done the killing of these children, but had organized the killing of the children. Now, if he was all those things we said, lunatic, psychotic, beast, our worst nightmare come to life, this would be a pretty straightforward study. We'd say you just got to identify people like that and keep them out of power, keep them out of the way of being able to perpetrate these atrocities. But I start with this story because, in my experience, with doing over 225 of these interviews and thousands of pages of archival work, he's very typical of perpetrators in that this was his village. This was his hometown. These people were not foreign to him. This was his church. He grew up as an altar boy in this church. He took mass in this church 2 weeks before he did the killing. He was the equivalent of a grade school teacher in this village. We asked him, were any of the children you killed your current or former students? He said, yes. He was a well-known footballer in the region. He coached the local soccer team. Were any of the children you killed your current or former athletes? He said, yes. When we went back to the village to interview people in the village, they all said about him, wonderful father, great husband, great son. We trusted him with our children. We could never believe he could have done something like this. When we pushed him in the interviews, how do you explain what you did in this case? All he kept repeating in Kinyarwanda was, I lost myself. I did not know who I was. So our job over the next half hour or so is, how do we explain the behavior of someone when that person can't even explain their own behavior? They can't put their fingers on why they did what they did. He was already convicted and sentenced. He wasn't trying to say something to me to lessen his sentence. He was being fully honest with himself to say, I could never have pictured myself doing it, but I did it, and I don't know how I came to do it. In my experience over the years with the interviews, the archival research, this is the general pattern of so-called ordinary people who become capable through a process, and process is a big word, of committing this type of extraordinary evil. Now, how many people are we talking about? We don't know the exact numbers here because perpetrators aren't lining up to write their memoirs. Perpetrators aren't generally having movies made about them. Perpetrators are hoping everyone forgets what they did and what happened. So all we have are estimates. I think I would go to the high end on all of these estimates in the Holocaust. I think close to 1 million Germans, Austrians, Croats, Lithuanians, Latvians, and others who were literally bloodied their hands with the hard work of killing. In Rwanda, a country the size of Vermont, it's estimated, I think, about 250,000 killers. The Rwandan government generally says it's closer to 1 million. I think that's probably too high, but at least 250,000. Bosnia-Herzegovina, judges there tell me that they're close to 25,000. Croats, Bosniaks, and mostly Serbs who committed atrocity crimes and have never been brought to justice and probably never going to be brought to justice. So in many ways, we don't know an answer to this question of numbers because, as I often say, genocide overwhelms justice. Justice can't keep up with it. In Rwanda, when the killing was over, there were 7 judges and lawyers left alive because most of the legal class were Tutsi. So in situations like that, justice has to pick and choose who they go after And justice tends to go after the big fish. They tend to go after the architects, some bureaucrats, maybe some notable rank and file, but by and large, rank and file go back to doing whatever they did before the war started. I would say, based on my experience, I think 95% of people who commit these type of atrocities will never be brought to justice. The justice system just can't keep up with it at that pace. So my central research question is, who are these people and what's the process? And again, I bolded that word because to me in genocide studies, process is the most important word we have. It's how we understand how genocide unfolds. It's how we understand how perpetrators are made. And most importantly, and if there's one thing you remember from tonight, please let it be this. When you understand genocide as process, the process piece gives you opportunities to interrupt the process. It gives you chances to stop the process before it reaches the point of killing. So when we see dehumanization, when we see othering, when we see legal exclusion, when we see social exclusion, when we understand that those are part of the process that can lead to genocidal destruction, we understand that those are opportunities to turn the process in a different direction. Now, with perpetrators, I've wanted to, and this has been for better or for worse, this kind of encapsulates my career. I've spent my career trying to recapture the experiential history of these killers. What choices did they face? Not what choices we think they faced. What choices did they think they faced? Because that's what impacted their behavior. What emotions did they feel? How did a father or a mother of children choose to kill other children? What emotions do they feel? How did they turn those emotions off? How do they cope with what they've done? Because again, I've never interviewed a perpetrator who said, "Yep, I knew from the very beginning when I had a chance, this is what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be a killer and I wanted to kill these people." To a person, they've all said, "Never thought I would be capable of doing this. I know I made decision after decision after decision that led me to this point, but I can't believe I did it." How do they cope with the reality of what they've done? What changes did they undergo as part of the process? So, in an essence, I've been trying to step into the shoes of rank and file killers to understand their decision making from their perspective, how the process unfolded, not as an academic exercise, certainly not to excuse their behavior or apologize for it. I'm not even I don't even want any part of that piece, but doing it to believe that if we can understand the process, maybe we can understand how to interrupt some of these steps in the process. Other people before me have looked at this question. I'm not generally a creative guy, so it's not like I came up with a question nobody else had asked. Other people had asked it, but I think the answers that other scholars had come up with, I found limited in many respects. Some people said, for instance, it's just the nature of the collective. Groups of people come together, bad things happen. That I know that's true sometimes. I'm here at UConn. Last year at this time, we won the national championship in basketball. We have a chance for our women to do the same in a week or so. We knew what happened in 2023 when we won. People tore lampposts down. There was destruction. So in 2024, we just took the lamppost down. So when we won, celebration broke out. Why in the world people have to destroy property when they celebrate, I don't know. But there were no lampposts for students to use because we knew as a group some nasty stuff happened. But it's also true that when groups come together, some incredible good things can happen. Many of you are part of groups that the group does some incredibly positive things. So I don't want to fall for the mistaken belief that somehow every time a group comes together, horrible things happened. If that was true, probably none of us would be here now. The species probably wouldn't have survived. Other people have said it's an ideology. It's just what people believe. If you can change their belief system about the other, you can stop this. Again, I do think ideology and belief systems are important, but they're not the only thing. I mean, with a problem this complex, if someone tries to sell you on the argument that I can answer this problem with just one factor, and that one factor is ideology or anything else, you have to understand that's not true. A complex problem like this, there's going to be a multi-causal, multifactorial explanation. It's not just going to be one thing. I think the most common things people jump to are what I've called the mad Nazi and bad Nazi thesis. The mad Nazi thesis is that somehow perpetrators must suffer from some form of pathology, low intelligence. They're just very different from us. And this is the theme. What we want perpetrators to be is different from us. We don't want them to be like us because that's too overwhelming for us to deal with. We want them to be different from us. And at Nuremberg, my chair is named for Senator Chris Dodd. His father, Senator Thomas Dodd, was one of the chief prosecutors at Nuremberg. So I'm in Nuremberg fairly often because it's part of the connection of the work we do here at UConn and the Dodd Center for Human Rights. And at Nuremberg, we had a psychiatrist and psychologist who were able to walk the jail cells of the 21 defendants. I know the slide says 22, but one killed himself awaiting trial and gave out IQ tests and gave out Rorschach tests. Now, IQ tests, let's talk about that one first. IQ tests are normed at 100. Again, keeping in mind what I said previously, that we want perpetrators to be different from us. What the world wanted to see with the intelligence testing was that these Nazi defendants, and these were all architects, but we have similar results for rank and file. We wanted to see that these defendants had low intelligence. Because if they have low intelligence, that's the explanation. And we can fix that. That's what education is for. We can take care of low intelligence. But what did we see? The men in the dock at Nuremberg, average IQ is 100. They were testing 110, 120, some of them as high as 130 and 140. That's genius range. So they weren't just average intelligence, they were above average intelligence. So it's not a low intelligence issue. So many people believe, well, if it's not low intelligence, then certainly they have to be pathological. They have to suffer from some type of mental or emotional disorder. And our go-to test for that in the 1940s, and still a very popular test today, is the Rorschach test. This is a test where it's called a projective. It's vague, it's ambiguous. You're asked what you see here, and you're supposed to, in your answer, you're projecting parts of your personality you may not even be aware of. And in the hands of someone trained in a Rorschach test, this can be a very valid and reliable form of assessment of pathology or mental health. Now, again, what do we want to see in the defendants? Because we want them to be different from us, we want to see high levels of pathology. We expect to see high levels of pathology, that for men to come up with these type of policies and do this type of work, they have to be pathological. What did we see in the results of the Rorschach, which people still analyze today and still come up with the same results? We saw that with one exception, everyone tested at Nuremberg tested well within the bounds of normality. One psychologist said, after he read the findings, these men tested as psychologically healthy and normal, certainly more healthy and normal than I feel after I read these results. That's how disturbing it was. The only Nuremberg defendant who tested as pathological was Julius Streicher. He was the editor of Der Stürmer from Nuremberg, southern Bavaria. But what you need to know about Streicher is before the trial started, his co-defendants, other Nazis, said about him, we don't want to be tried with Streicher because he makes us look bad. When a Nazi says about you that you make them look bad, pretty clearly you're you're identifiable as someone very different, and Stryker was. But generally speaking, everyone else tested well within the bounds of normality. We've seen similar results about IQ and personality tests with rank and file perpetrators as well. So if it's not a mad Nazi thesis, some people have argued it's a bad Nazi thesis. There's some type of twisted personality or personality cluster like the authoritarian personality that can explain who's more likely than other people to commit these atrocities. And to make a very long story short, we have looked for this personality cluster or syndrome for decades after the Holocaust, and we just never found it. There is no personality trait. There's no cluster of personality traits that allow us to determine who is more likely than someone else to commit these type of atrocities. So what that leaves us with is my central argument. It's not intelligence, it's not pathology, it's not a personality type, but it's ordinary people like you and me who commit the vast majority of genocide and mass killing. Another way of saying this is that perpetrators are not a type. If you're looking for a type, you won't find it. Perpetrators are not a type. Perpetrators are people like you and me. And I understand this is really difficult argument to admit, to understand, to absorb, in part because of what it says about all the people who live around us, that we go to school with, that we live with, to recognize that, wow, these people have the capacity to do something like this. But the really tough piece of this reality is, what does it say about me? What does it say about my capacity? Again, I'm not talking about probability. Statistically, hardly any of us are ever going to do this, but people do it around the world because we all have the capacity to do it. So it's not just what it says about people around me, but it's what it says about me and the capacity I would have to commit these type of atrocities. And again, if you're sitting there like most of us are thinking, oh no, I would never do this. I'm a resistor, I'm a rescuer, I could never do anything like this. All I can tell you is every perpetrator I've ever spoken to would have said the exact same thing in the years and months before he or she committed the atrocities they committed. So, what I've tried to develop, and if you're reading the book, a part of the book this semester, this is different. I'm working on a third edition of this book. I've been working on it for a few years, but I keep writing other books in place of it. And that's fine, but I do need to get back to this third edition. And I'm thinking about it differently. I'm thinking of a staircase model here of perpetrator psychology that helps us understand the choices people make in an escalating series of choices. And the staircase model says at each step on the staircase, you could do something different. You could get off the staircase. You could interrupt the process. But as you keep going, you start to see a set of commitments to what eventually brings you to the point where it seems like the next logical thing is to kill this person, to kill these people. So, how do we get there? I think we start with thinking that the other is an existential threat. All societies have others within them. In the US, we've made an art of making the other and othering people. We're doing that now from the highest levels of political office down to the lowest levels of street discourse. We are making the other and we're constructing the other. That in itself is a dangerous thing. But what really becomes dangerous in understanding perpetrator behavior is when the other that we've made comes to be seen as an existential threat. In other words, a threat to my existence. When the other is a threat to my economic existence because they take my jobs. When the other is a threat to my religious existence because they threaten my faith. When the other is a threat to my physical existence. These are the things that start to become very dangerous. I get asked often, What do you see as the biggest warning factor for genocide? As I said earlier, complex problem is not going to be one thing. But if I'm pushed on it, what is one thing that really captures my attention? It's when the other is talked about as an existential threat from politicians, from religious leaders, from teachers, in social media. When we see that type of discourse, this is the beginning of something that, if left unchecked, can become very destructive. I think, secondly, with perpetrators, I do see a complete moral reorientation of their universe. I think when I first started in this work, I thought it was a turning off of morality, like you turn off a switch. I don't think it's that at all anymore because every perpetrator I've interviewed has gone to often great lengths to convince me of how moral they are as a person. Even if they killed 52 people, they still think they're a moral person. So it's not that they've turned morality off, but they've reoriented it. In other words, they've changed it to say, I'm a good moral person to these people. Now, I can kill these other people, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm a good moral person because I've just reoriented my morality this way, and it only applies to this group of people. How do we do that? I think perpetrators do this through a lot of mechanisms. I think they search for moral justification. They want to think they're doing the right thing for the right reason. We don't do well when we behave in ways where we're doing the wrong thing and we know we're doing the wrong thing. We want to convince ourselves I'm doing the right thing here and I'm doing it for the right reason. So perpetrators go to great lengths to justify in their mind morally why they're doing the right thing in killing this group of people. I think dehumanization of victims is a big piece of this moral reorientation. I often think here of Franz Stangl, Commandant of Treblinka, at his trial. There's this dramatic moment where a survivor of Treblinka stands up in the audience. He's not on the witness stand or anything. He just stands up and he yells at Stangl and he says, Why? Why did you beat us? Why did you spit on us? Why did you strip us? Why did you humiliate us? Why did you call us names? Because your camp only existed to put us to death. You knew you were going to kill us. Why did you do all these other things to take away our humanity? And Stangel's answer is remarkable. He says, because it made it easier for my men to do what they had to do. If we took away your humanity, killing you wasn't the big deal it would have been had we been face to face with you as a fellow human. And then finally, there's euphemistic labeling of evil actions. Perpetrators will talk often about the work they've done without ever describing it as killing or murder. They'll talk about liquidation. They'll talk about cleansing. They'll talk about relocation. They'll talk about removal. And they'll avoid labeling the event for what it was because, again, you have to understand about perpetrators, they're trying to protect themselves psychologically and emotionally from what they've done. They're building lies around themselves. They're building a scaffolding around themselves mentally and emotionally so that they can live with themselves. And these are some of the tools they use to do it. I think thirdly, and if there's a common feature I've seen across, I would say, every interview I've done, is some aspect of blaming the victims. Perpetrators are remarkably adept at blaming the victims for their own victimization. You and I do this often as well. I mean, this is not unheard of. If you work with victims of sexual assault, they'll tell you that one of the most painful pieces of their recovery is someone close to them asking, What were you wearing? What did you say? How much did you have to drink? Why were you there that time of night? All these questions that we're trying to restore our sense of a fair world by blaming the victims for their own victimization. And perpetrators have taken this to an art form. I can give two quick examples. I interviewed one Holocaust perpetrator in 1990. He had been convicted of crime, served his time. And the first 44 minutes of the interview, he said all the right things. Horrible what we did to the Jews. stain our national conscience, should never have done it. We have to repay, we have to make reparations, on and on and on. But I still remember the final minute of the interview. He was an older guy, and he kind of moved himself up in his chair and he pointed at my face and he said, "But you have to remember, they were going to take over the world." And then he sat back, and I thought, okay, that's how you lived with yourself. You really do think you did the right thing. You stopped Jews from taking over the world. Another example, just as ridiculous, I was interviewing a group of Serbian policemen who were all still policemen but had committed atrocities, genocide at Srebrenica. And we interviewed them one by one. This was an interview the translator and I did in a bar they went to after their shift was over. And one of the questions we always ask is about the victim group. In this case, why the Muslims? Why the Bosniaks? Why did you target them? And the first person said, really without hesitation, because they killed Christ. And I let it go. I didn't know if there was something weird about the translation or whatever. We went to the second one. Why the Muslims? Because they killed Christ. Third one, why the Muslims? Because they killed Christ. And my translator is getting increasingly agitated here because, as most of you know, the Muslim faith isn't around for close to 700 years after Christ. This isn't like Monday, Tuesday. This is 700 years before the Muslim faith even exists. And when we began to point this out to the people we were interviewing, generally what we got was, no, no, don't confuse me with the facts. My priest blessed me the night before the killing. He told me we're doing God's work because Muslims had killed Christ, and that's what we believe. One person we finally got to admit, to reflect on it. He said, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe the Muslims weren't around at the time of Christ, so they couldn't kill them. But he said, if they had been around, they would have killed them. I mean, that's how ridiculous blaming the victims gets. That's an important piece of how perpetrators cope with their own work. I think there's also a group identification that's important. These first three things, the other is existential threat, moral reorientation, blaming the victims. You can do those in the privacy of your own home. You don't have to be with other people to do it. But genocide doesn't happen because one person goes on a killing spree. It happens because groups of people come together to kill other people in large numbers and over extended period of time. So in terms of group identification, I am interested in those basic group dynamic things that some of you will recognize from your intro to social psychology class. What role does conformity to peer pressure play? What about repression of individual conscience? I'll see this often in my interviews that perpetrators aren't really dealing with their own conscience. They're turn things over to the group, and they'll talk about the group conscience because it's not their individual conscience they have to deal with. It's the group that did this. And then finally, de-individuation, killing done because you're in uniform, you all have the same haircut, you have the same uniform, you look the same, you act the same. That can build a certain camaraderie, but can also lead to a certain type of de-individuation where you don't have that individual identity. You've given it over to a group. And then the final thing I look at is what I call a socialization into cruelty. What are the factors that teach people and socialize and bring people into cruelty? I've never interviewed a perpetrator who said to me, the first kill was easy. I was glad to do it. I did it quickly. I did it efficiently, had no problem. Every time we've talked about this in interviews, perpetrators have come up with some form of, that first kill was tough. I had to be drunk. I had to be high. I vomited. I hallucinated. I tried not to do it. I'm thinking of one perpetrator in Rwanda who said, I just cut someone real, superficially. I held up my machete and I said, I've got blood. I've killed it. I've killed a Tutsi. And then his comrades look at him and say, no, you didn't kill anyone. We're going to stand here and watch you until you kill them. So this socialization into cruelty, I think, is an important piece. Here I'm looking at things like escalating commitments, the choices, and I want to emphasize this word choice and agency. Perpetrators sometimes want to pass themselves off as we had to do it. We didn't have any choice but to do it. They absolutely had choice. They absolutely had agency. I will go back to that first example I gave of the killer in Rwanda. Um, as we did the interview with him, the person who had killed the children in Tarama, he started to get some sense of, in his mind, we were kind of on his side because he got a sense of, well, you understand it. It was the situation that forced me to do it. It wasn't my choice. I had to do it because I was in that situation. And we were trying to explain to him, yes, we're very much interested in those situational influences, but no matter how strong the situational influences are, you still had agency. You still had choice. And I had gotten to know his village well enough to know that he had two brothers who lived during the same thing, grew up in the same home, went to the same church, went to the same school. During the massacre at Intirama, they weren't heroes. Don't get me wrong. They didn't do anything good, but they didn't do what their brother did. They didn't kill people. They certainly didn't kill in the way he killed. So, same similar type of situational pressures, they chose to do something different. Again, not heroic, but they did not kill. So, the agency there of making escalating commitments is important. The ritual conduct, here I'm interested in the rituals that killers go through to become part of a group, the type of hazing that goes into often these group dynamics of killing, and then just how the role starts to become the person that when you're a killer, I do think it fundamentally alters who you are as a person. And I think this for me is one of the things I often get into trouble when I bring up in some countries is I understand you want to give all the money and the services to the survivors, and they should get the majority of it. But if you think with perpetrators, you're just going to leave them sitting in jail forever, or that one day they'll come out of jail after they serve their time, and you think they're just going to go back to being good people, that's not going to happen. These people have been fundamentally altered by what they've done, and there will need to be some type of therapeutic intervention to start to break down the people they've become because of the actions they've taken to kill. So, in short, just go back here quickly. Those are the five pieces of the staircase that I'm interested in. It's a process piece, and because it's a process piece, every step here is a chance to interrupt the process. When we see people starting to talk about other people as existential threat, and we see this regardless of your political persuasion, I think we can all agree that we see this as a major piece of American discourse right now. The other, however you define the other, is depicted as a threat to our existence. That type of language, when left unchecked, can kind of lead to the process of destruction that we're talking about here. It can lead into moral reorientation. It can certainly lead into blaming the victim. So, in terms of early warning, we want to pay attention to these type of things because if left unchecked, they absolutely can do some significant damage. This is the second edition that some of you may be reading of Becoming Evil. Again, working, rethinking the third edition based on the continuing interviews I've done over the years. And for me, this staircase model is helping to catch the process piece that has become so important for me. And I'll finish here and then we can take questions. I've never been interested in this topic as an academic topic. I'm interested in it from an activist perspective. I honestly, in terms of professional identity, tend to think of myself much more as an activist than I do in a traditional academic. So for me, this activist perspective has been how can we understand the process, not to forgive, not to apologize, not to forget, but to unpack it so we can think about different ways to interrupt this process. Because this is my dream of a world, is I want to live in a world where an architect comes to power and says, we would love to kill this group of people, but we can't find anyone to do the killing. We don't live in that world right now. They can always find people to do the killing. So can somehow we develop a world where enough people would say to an architect who is bloodthirsty, we're not going to do it. We're not going to carry out these type of atrocities. It's not the world we live in now, but I have hopes it's the world that we can eventually develop together. So I know we have about 15, 20 minutes for questions and comments. I will stop sharing the screen. Um, I see some things in Q&A. Stephen, do you want me to just take those or do you want to
Yeah,
moderate
well,
it?
I'll moderate it. Let's start with a
Sounds good.
question about gender. What percentage of perpetrators are women?
Yeah, relatively small percentage, but not non-existent. I think when I struggled with the question of gender when I wrote the first edition of Becoming Evil because we just didn't have that much research related to gender like we do now from Wendy Lauer and other people. So I wasn't sure if the low representation of females and perpetrators was a capacity issue, that there's something about quote unquote feminine nature that makes women less likely to commit these crimes, or was it an opportunity issue? So I did what academics did in the first edition is I buried that whole discussion in a ridiculous footnote at the end of the book that I was hoping no one would ever read because I really didn't know what I was talking about. Second edition, I had done more research with some female perpetrators. Other people, as I said, had begun to do research. So my position now is it's not a capacity issue. Women have the same capacity to inflict the same level of cruelty as men do. And we should know that. I mean, Holocaust memoirs have talked for years about some of the worst guards in the concentration camp were women. So we should have listened to that. So it's not a capacity issue. I think it's an opportunity issue. Genocidal societies tend to be kind of male dominated, some levels of toxic masculinity, and women just have different roles to play in those societies that don't give them as much of an opportunity to kill. The first person convicted of genocide by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was a woman. The Minister of Culture and Education and Family Affairs, I think, was roughly her title. So, absolutely, women can commit this same level of atrocities when given the opportunity to do so.
Mhm. So we have two questions that are, I think, more or less the same. How do we interrupt the process? How do we get people off the staircase?
No, no, thank you. That is, that's the piece of the research I'm still working on and still thinking through. I think, let me see if I can come up with a concrete example or two. One of the things that Rwanda has done that I think has been helpful in this regard, and I was involved in very early on, is that part of the process of genocide in Rwanda was a very heavy culture of obedience to authority. People deferred to authority. It was a cultural characteristic. People saw it as an endearing cultural characteristic. It was very important to what it meant to be Rwandan. But Rwanda recognized when the genocide was over, that also had a very dark side to it, that deference to authority. So in many curricula in Rwandan grade schools now, children are being taught differently about authority. You don't always defer to it, but for instance, you ask two questions. One, is the request coming from a legitimate authority? In other words, does this person really, are they in a position to really be an authority to ask this? And then secondly, is what they're asking a legitimate thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? Now, that may seem fairly simple to us, But in a culture that has a deep sense of obedience to authority, if you're teaching a generation of children to at least ask, is this person really an authority? And is what they're asking me to do a legitimate thing to do? That's a huge step forward to think about authority differently. So I think that's a big piece of it. A second example, I think much of genocide happens with military and security sector involvement. So work a lot with military and police around the world, and this is one of the questions I'm trying to push them to ask is how can your culture be different in a way that encourages disobedience rather than obedience? So is there something about the culture that we can change? And I'll use this example in America because most of us are more familiar with it. I'll work with American police departments who will say, particularly after George Floyd and other examples of police brutality, will say, well, we do our work because we're weeding out all the bad apples at recruitment. So they take personality tests, we do extensive interviews, and we look for references. And if they are going to be a bad apple, we don't even let them come into the academy. And I'm all for that. But I think the harder question to ask is, what's the culture of the academy? What's the culture of the locker room? What's the culture of the squad car? Because if that culture is toxic, it doesn't matter that you've weeded out the bad apples. You're bringing good apples into a bad barrel, and they have the risk of being spoiled in kind of the same way. So I think those cultural things are part of starting to unwrap this process.
Mhm. So one of the students in the course has asked about the relationship between ordinary evil, which perpetuate conditions like poverty, domestic violence, and extraordinary evil. And are those two things linked in a causal way, or?
That's a great question. I'll try not to be long-winded on this one because it's a big piece. When I first wrote the first edition of Becoming Evil in 2001, the book was in print with Oxford on 9/11. The book was not titled Becoming Evil. I had actually, at great length in the first chapter, talked about why evil was an antiquated concept. No one uses it. People only talk about it in Sunday school. I wanted nothing to do with it. When George Bush, in his first remarks after 9/11, used the word evil, all of a sudden the word was everywhere. And Oxford said, well, we think this would be a good book title. This would sell because everybody's talking about evil. And I was like, okay. As an author, you don't really have that much control over the title, it turns out. So we went with the title, but it's opened up this whole can of worms about what evil is. And I had to rewrite that whole portion of the chapter. What's ordinary evil? What's extraordinary evil? So those are philosophical questions kind of outside of my scope. I've defined my area of research as looking at people who kill other people in the context of genocide, mass atrocity. Now, some of the things we've talked about in the staircase model, can they apply, for instance, to understanding structural systems of poverty and inequality? Yeah, I think absolutely so. Dehumanizing the other, seeing the other as some type of existential threat, moral justification. These are things we do to keep some of those structures in place if they work to our advantage. So, yeah, I absolutely think those can apply to quote unquote. I don't tend to hear the word ordinary evil phrase as much as I do everyday evil. And there are people who work on everyday evil. I'm not one of those people, but I think some of these things can apply there as well.
Mhm. So we have three questions on Israel and Gaza, and just I want to insert myself here and remind everybody that in 2 weeks we have Usama Makdisi from UC Berkeley, who will be speaking on Palestinians and the question of genocide. But I'll let you grapple with this as you wish.
So the question is
Well,
are Israel's
there's three on Israel
okay.
and Gaza. One asks, about descendants of genocide, perpetuating
Mhm.
genocide, allegedly.
Okay.
Um, yeah, go.
Sure. No, no, thanks. Thanks for the questions. Yeah, the past couple of years, you can't do a talk like this without getting those questions. So I understand and I appreciate, I'm just looking at the questions now. I appreciate the sensitivity and respect that you ask them with is nice to see. So thank you for that. Um, I think whenever I think about Israel, Gaza, I will say two things. One is first, and this is what I work with my students on, you can't approach anything about the current situation without understanding the trauma that Jewish people have lived through because of the Holocaust. That when someone says they're going to wipe you off the face of the earth, that's not paranoia to believe it because someone did try to wipe you off the face of the earth. So you have to understand that trauma. And you also have to understand the trauma of the Nakba for Palestinian people, 700,000 people forcibly displaced in the late 1940s to make room for the state of Israel. Those two traumas inform a lot of trying to understand why this has been so contentious for so long. Second thing I would say is people get caught up in the genocide question. And I understand why. Genocide's a big word. That's the weight we want to throw around. But the mass atrocity crimes at the international level, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the crime of genocide. Eventually, a court will decide on the crime of genocide if that's happening in Gaza or not. And for that decision, there's going to have to be intent. That's a big part of it. I know people who I respect very much who would argue that they think it's going to be demonstrated that Israel has committed the crime of genocide in Gaza. I know people I respect very much who say they don't think it's going to be demonstrated, that the intent piece isn't there. So I tend to take genocide off the table in this discussion and say the courts will eventually adjudicate that. Let's focus on what we know is occurring. War crimes absolutely have occurred. I mean, we have a terrorist act perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th, the taking of hostages, international crime. Israel's committed war crimes in response to that. Crimes against humanity, of which there's like 16 different crimes against humanity. The key one is forcible displacement of people. Has that happened in Gaza? Yes. So, war crimes and crimes against humanity, we can get our heads around right now and say that those things are happening. In war, almost always both sides commit war crimes. Every war the US has ever been involved in, we've committed war crimes. Crimes against humanity are pretty common, so it's not unusual to see these things. I think what's important is to understand the suffering of people in Gaza. They don't give a damn if it's war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. They just know they're suffering. And if we can't be more creative about how to alleviate the suffering of large numbers of civilians caught in the vice between Hamas and Israel, we're going to be held accountable for that. So I worry less about what we're calling the crimes, and I worry more about the fact that we have incontrovertible evidence that large numbers of civilians are suffering because they're caught in this vice between Hamas and Israel. And if we can't somehow find a way to alleviate that suffering, that's a poor excuse for response here. So I hope that's of help.
Yeah, well, I'm reminded of Dirk Moses's point that because we treat genocide as the crime par excellence, we often look past war crimes and crimes against humanity as being somehow lesser on the scale of evil.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly, exactly. And
um,
they're not lesser. I mean, and there's no sentencing difference. I've interviewed people who have been sentenced longer for war crimes than someone else who was sentenced for genocide. So you're exactly right, Stephen. There is no discrepancy in the three, but we tend to think the genocide word's the big one.
Yeah. So we're collaborating this semester with a class at Santa Rosa Junior College, and my colleague there, Johan van Gorp, has passed along a couple of questions from his students. And I think I'll read one of them here. Since the othering of groups often happens simultaneously in societies, for instance, Bosnia-Herzegovina, how does the power of the state fit into the staircase model?
No, it's a great question, and thank you for being here and for your students being involved as well. I think the point of your question is well taken, that all of us in society construct the other, and we come up with the other, and sometimes maybe we discriminate against the other. Maybe we engage in acts of everyday evil. The othering that I'm talking about as an existential threat is what you pointed to, which is when the power of the state comes into it. And I would say not only the power of the state, the power of religion, the power of education, whatever powers there are in a society, when those powers start to engage in discourse about the other as an existential threat, that gives a permission structure for us to kind of act on some of our worst impulses. So I'm less concerned with the individual otherings that we do at an individual micro level. I'm much more concerned at the macro level when the state, religious institutions, judicial institutions, when they start to justify the other as an existential threat, that to me becomes the big warning sign here.
Yeah. So I see a student in the course has asked you to comment on the culture of U.S. politics, and I'm reminded of the fact that this was really the topic of your talk at the 40th anniversary celebrations, and I want to note that a lot of what you predicted might happen has since come to pass. So,
Oh,
um,
yeah, I think I've forgotten that. Yeah, this is and I'm going to say this as a disclaimer because I think I've always been kind of prided myself that I've wanted to keep everybody in the room and everyone in a discussion, and I've not wanted to be partisan with these discussions. I'm going to be honest with you, this is more difficult for me now because my daughter had her dream job of working for USAID, and that job was taken from her by someone who thinks it's cool to take a chainsaw to an organization like that and throw it in the wood chipper. So I'm angry. I'm hurt. I, for whatever I predicted, which honestly I don't remember, for whatever I said about bad things on the horizon, I didn't anticipate anything like this. The
Yeah.
rapidity of what's happening, the it's not a constitutional crisis like some people describe it. I think it's just a constitutional reordering, a constitutional reconstruction. It's just different, and it's going to be different for a long time. And agencies that we've destroyed are not going to be built back up with the next incoming administration. They're just not. It's going to take decades for us to recover much of what we've lost with this type of destruction. So I think the things where we've always talked about politics in the US trending lately toward more authoritarianism and so on, those aren't alarmist anymore. I mean, these are autocratic tendencies that are playing out. I think we're a two-party system. That's unusual. Bosnia-Herzegovina, I think, has what I read today, 148 different political parties. We just really have two major ones. One now is in power, the other one's dysfunctional and doesn't know what to do and how to respond and how to even go about it. So I think everyone is still just so caught off guard by it, but it is things are changing at a constitutional level that will take a long time to unwind and a long time to change back to a different thing. So we have taken othering to a very different level. We are very clearly defining who's in and who's out. We have removed freedom of speech. We have prestigious institutions like Columbia caving, capitulating, complying, and that sets the stage for other institutions to do the same. So I think right now, many of us are waiting for what is the voice of resistance? Where's that focus of resistance comes from? Because without it, we will become effectively a one-party system. And that's not a good political system to be under. So I do, I do worry about process by which democracy and democratic institutions are being dismantled. And I would say if we would see this in any other country in the world, we'd look at it and say, all right, that country's on a dark, dark path. It doesn't make it any different because we think we're America and these things don't happen here. This is what America was founded on: slavery and genocide and othering and existential threat. And it's been a big part of our history. So I don't want to be so naive to think it's America, it's not going to happen here. It's
Yeah.
it's happening.
Okay. Let me just scroll back through. I think a lot of these questions we touched on in one way or another here. Yeah, Ella Andrada has asked about the relationship between war and genocide, and does war facilitate the...
Well, that's a great question. I'd say most often genocide is done under the cover of war. There are times, I think Cambodia is an example of genocide that occurs not really under the context of traditional warfare, but most often genocide occurs under the cover of war because wartime powers in a country tend to give it those expansive powers. And again, this is where, and this connects a little bit with the US question. After 9/11, I was terrified because once you call it the war on terrorism, it should be the criminal pursuit of terrorism. But once you call it the war on terrorism, you've given yourself a much wider range of perceived powers because it's quote unquote war. So war and genocide very often go together. War is a cover for genocide. Doesn't have to be that way, but more often than not is.